You know him. Every Patagonia-wearing finance bro knows him. But he is literally, compared to today's topic, Ivar Kreuger. If Jordan Belfort was the wolf of Wall Street, Ivar fucking owned it. I've spent 2 weeks learning about this man, and I'm 25% mad at his fraud, 100% impressed, and 1000% sure that he is the coolest financier of all fucking time. I'm swearing way too much, and my math doesn't really add up. But you know what? Neither did Ivar's. In fact, it took a Swedish accounting firm 18 years to try and figure out what the hell had happened. But to this day, not a single person fully understands, not even his own business partners. Yeah, sure about that. It is estimated that Ivar ended up embezzling or frauding for around $20 billion. But besides that, he was one of the richest men in the entire world. So what the hell pushed him? Well, Ivar wasn't just a smart businessman and an embezzler. He was a financial creative genius. You know that you today can trade a B share on basically any company in the entire world. Well, it was Ivar who invented the B share. He invented it to keep control of his own company. But we'll get there. But mostly, he was a badass entrepreneur. One who founded mostly legit companies. And some of them are still going today. Well, in fact, 8 out of 30 of the largest companies in Sweden till this day was founded by Ivar and his partners. 8! That's more than freaking Elon Musk. And much like Elon Musk, he also involved himself with politics. And no, that didn't turn out well either. See, Ivar loaned money to governments around Europe to try and help rebuild the countries after World War I. However, he mostly helped rebuild the region so that he could get monopoly rights to sell his matches. Because Ivar, in fact, earned himself the nickname the Match King. He didn't just earn himself by some partners or anything like that. No. Time magazine published an article calling him the Match King. In fact, at one point, his companies were so successful that 60 to 70% of the entire modernized world used matches made by him. Now, matches today are not as relevant as they were back then, because back then lighters weren't stable enough yet to use to light fire. So every single cigarette, food, water, everything was used starting with a Ivar match. And that is insane to think that he just influenced the entire world like that. Sadly, in 1932, he died mysteriously in a hotel in Paris. Now, a lot of people are calling foul play because the family who ended up taking over after him was one that didn't really fit in the picture that he had drawn up. And oh yeah, his death, it resulted in another financial crisis called the Kreuger crisis. It was literally named after him. And here's why. 10% of the entire money in Sweden was borrowed to this man, who ended up being a fraudster. Horrible situations. Millions of people ended up in poverty, and the Prime Minister of Sweden ended up stepping down. This is a detailed story of Ivar Kreuger. Thank you for surviving the world's longest introduction to a YouTube video. Let's run this back to 1880, when Ivar was born. He was born into a large family. He had 5 siblings, which was quite normal at the time. What wasn't normal was the fact that he was born into a kind of rich family. You see, Ivar's dad owned a match factory. He did so because he inherited that from his granddad, who was a successful businessman. This isn't a story of rags to riches. This is a story of rich to mega wealthy. Okay, so it's fair to say that he's born into a bit of wealth. What does that mean? Well, for Ivar, he was quite lucky, fortunate even. He became an engineer. He had a good education, something that was not normal at the time. He went to technical school to learn about construction and buildings, and that would definitely help him later in life. You see, Ivar as a child was rumored to be a bit of a cheater. One that always founded these kind of boy groups that would go together and cut corners. Yeah, please notice that I said rumored, because that's the deal about Ivar's story. There's so many articles, so many news, so many movies, TV shows, blog posts, podcasts, radio shows, you freaking name it about Ivar. He was insanely famous for his time. So every single one of these are trying to spin a story in a different direction. Either Ivar was a genius or Ivar was a fraudster. Someone trying to embezzle everything. So which one is true? I don't know. To me, it just kind of sounds like Ivar was one of the boys, and I will not fault him for that. Moving on, Ivar, he grew up, and unlike most people at the time, Ivar went out traveling. He went to the US for a bit. He then moved on to Mexico, Egypt, India. Now, I didn't say all these in order, but that doesn't matter, because what you need to know is the fact that Ivar had the means to travel, and he met a lot of interesting people at the time. He even at one point started a restaurant for about 6 months before it went horribly bankrupt, because the man couldn't manage a restaurant. At the end of all of his travels, Ivar ended up moving to the US, where he started working in construction. Did he own the company? No, he didn't. And he didn't use his family wealth to get into it. He simply started working as an engineer, and he worked his way up fast. You see, Ivar was extremely meticulous. He noticed every single plan, every single schedule, and every single little error in said plan. And because he was noticing errors and plans and helping the construction planning, he ended up getting promoted very fast. He ended up working on buildings such as the iconic Macy's in New York. And here's the real deal breaker. Ivar learned a lot of very cutting-edge technologies. Now, it's funny to say that because what he really learned was the fact that he used steel bars inside of cement. Now, cutting edge at the time, yeah, because that allowed people to build skyscrapers. It was literally not possible before that. And that's kind of the catch. Back in Sweden, they didn't know how to use steel bars inside of cement. After working for a few years in construction, Ivar ended up taking his knowledge and moving back home, where he, with a friend called Paul Toll, started Kreuger and Toll. Kreuger and Toll was a construction company. They used everything that Ivar had learned in the US to start bidding in and building construction sites in Stockholm. Now, very fast they ended up being successful. And I just want to mention out why. Because Ivar did something kind of creative and very almost genius-like, okay? He was a businessman. Ivar did the thing where he wanted to bid on a construction site, a huge construction site in Stockholm, but he was too small. The company was too small, so they had no chance. They were going to go with one of the other ones. So Ivar did the unthinkable. Ivar said, if I am 1 day delayed, I will give you 5,000 Swedish in discount. At the time, this was completely unheard of. Every single construction site was majorly delayed, major delays all around. And that was what everyone just had come to expect. So when they read that deal, they said yes almost immediately. They're like, okay, you did a horrible deal. The thing was the fact that Ivar was sneaky and meticulous. So in the contract, Ivar had written that you would get 5,000 Swedish back, or he would get 5,000 Swedish back for every day that he was early. Every single one thought that Ivar had the worst contract of the century. But little did they know Ivar, and why should they? He was just a young guy running a company with one of his friends. When in reality, Ivar finished 21 days early and landed a serious big score. And why did he finish 21 days early? Because why was everyone else majorly delayed, but this young kid could suddenly be early? Well, Ivar had a different strategy with his workers. A, he paid them a bonus for finishing early. B, he asked them to work 7 days a week. Remember, back then, that was even unheard of. If you work 7 days a week, that's because you were a impoverished, horrible situation where you were forced to work in a factory, like for one of Ivar's match factories. We'll get back to that. So now he's paying bonuses to his own construction workers to finish early, and they help him do it, not just one time, continuously. And it was also great for the people on the other end of the contract because wow, they finished early. Now, this big score continues for a while. Project to project, Ivar finishes early, and he basically invents this type of contract. Because until that point, no one in Sweden, Scandinavia, or at least any US know this type of contract. So he's sort of credited with this called daily delayed fee contractual work. His construction company, Kreuger and Toll, ended up building some of the most epic buildings in Stockholm. In fact, they built the Olympic Stadium for the Olympic race in the 1910s in Stockholm. Absolutely amazing piece of buildings. And he also went out to build the Scania building and other buildings. In general, his influence of Kreuger and Toll, or KNT, ended up having on Stockholm helped shape the city and the way it looks till this day. So for the first 4 or 5 years, from 1908 and going forward to 1913-ish, Kreuger and Toll was his main focus. And he did well. However, in and around the early 1910s, his family's match factory, one that he actually never cared for, started getting into trouble. They started to become financially stressed because of the Jönköping Group. Now, we don't like the Jönköping Group at all, okay guys? We hate them. The Jönköping Group ended up forcing the prices, changing the delivery, and in general pushing his family's factory around. But his family shouldn't have worried, not even for a second, because they had Ivar in the family, and Ivar always had a plan, almost always. You see, Ivar had the idea to start the Svenska Tandsticksaktiebolaget. Okay, that was a Swedish word. It's just called STAB, S-T-A-B. Little fun side fact, Swedish Match would go on in 2014 to make the little nicotine pouch called Sin. Oh yeah, the one trending absolutely everywhere on social media was indirectly founded by Ivar as well. Don't worry, there's many more things like that. So what did Ivar do? How did he help out his family? Well, this little company that he started, Swedish Match would become a conglomerate in the matchmaking industry. And I'm not talking about Tinder matches, we're talking about steel and fire here, okay? Flint and stone. No. See, Ivar's plan was kind of simple and genius. He knew that the Jönköping group exported to a set of Eastern European countries. So what did Ivar do? Well, he had the company export to the Western European countries. Genius. He was in a less competition area. And now here's the first thing you have to understand about Ivar. He is cunning, and history kind of has a few glimpses, and this is one of them. It is not fully known how or why, but Ivar ended up buying other companies in the matchmaking industry. Simply the production. He ended up buying one competitor, another competitor, and hell yeah, he ended up doing a 360 and buying Jönköping Group. They are now producing his matches, and I'm sure that must have felt freaking good. So rather quickly, Ivar managed to create a little monopoly in Sweden. To be precise, he created a monopoly on producing matches. The Swedish government themselves were actually selling the matches, he was just producing them. Now, he ended up owning almost every single match factory in the entirety of Sweden. He also owned some in Finland and Norway. But this is not why he's called the Match King. But we will get back to that shortly. During the World War I in the 1910s, Sweden's stock market had a serious boom. So Ivar wasn't just becoming wealthy on the construction company, on the matchmaking company, but also just in general of being a rich guy in freaking Sweden at a good time, okay? So what did Ivar do with all his new wealth? He invested heavily into his own suppliers, meaning that Ivar's idea wasn't that I want to buy wood cheap from my suppliers, or hell no, Ivar wanted to freaking own the forest. Absolutely every single piece of the vertical supply line he wanted to own. If someone was making paperback to wrap in his matches, he bought them. And that's a crazy thing to think about, that he was one of the first people to essentially acquire his entire supply chain in order to retain all the profits for himself or for the Swedish match company. Now, to be precise, he didn't only just buy the forests, the wood, the paperback, he also bought the sawmills, the gold mines, coal mines, and a few other things. It's a very long list, okay? And I have chosen a few highlights. So now, due to this incredible gathering of wealth, his empire is slowly starting to form. But his empire wouldn't just be in matches. Oh hell no. His empire stretched way across that into different niches. Niches. You see, the man had so much ambition, and he knew that reputation was everything. If he had a good reputation, his stock would increase and he would have more money to invest. And he realized this kind of look. So what did the man do? He bought a news magazine. Actually, he kind of bought stakes into 2 of them, so that he could force the journalists to write good stories about him. Kind of genius, also a little bit dictatorish if you ask me. But not only in the type of written media, the man also invested in movies and TV shows. After the World War I, there was a boom of movies in Sweden, and he was in on it. And somehow, he woke up in the morning thinking, this is not enough, I want more. How the hell does this man have so many freaking hours in one day? Like, I swear to God, is it just because you're all using our phone today? Instagram cannot be taking that much time of me, okay? But this is insane. Because what he goes on to do is that he buys a little company called Ericsson, or partners into Ericsson. Little company. It is till this day one of the largest telecommunication companies in the entire world. I think it's around 20-23% of the entire world's telecommunications. Satellites, wires, whatever you name it, is still run by these guys. It is insane. Now, what was even more insane about the Ericsson deal was the fact that Ivar would go on to invent a little something called B shares. Now, I hinted this in the introduction, but a B share is essentially where you have no rights to vote inside the company. That means the guy with all the A shares can do all the voting rights, aka he remains in control. This is Ivar. He kept all the A shares himself and only sold out all the B shares, meaning that he had 100% control of the deal and the company going forward. Of course he did. Let's just take a second here to appreciate just how cool that he is to be so creative, to create a new financial instrument. One so solid, so useful, and today so common that every single company almost in the entire world uses it. It's hard to really imagine a company publicly traded not having a B share. It's also hard to think that it's just one guy and his own greed just creating it. Actually, now that I say that out loud, it's the stock market. Maybe that makes a lot of sense. Maybe that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And of course it was a fraudster. It is Wall Street, okay? So now the real question is, how much money was he really making from all of this? How in the hell could he afford to be buying up so many different companies, all whilst he was still running the construction company, the matchmaking company, etc.? In reality, back in 1917, when all of this boom started, Ivar split his construction company into 2. Paul Toll would remain in control of the construction side of the business. Ivar still owned a lot of it, of course. But then next to that, he made a holding company, Swedish Match Holding Company. Ivar remained fully in control of that. And that company would be publicly traded. But this is Ivar, so you might already have guessed it. Ivar only traded all the B shares and gave all the B shares to all of his friends while remaining in 100% control, holding all the A shares. Surprise. And that's kind of the deal, right? Ivar realized that he was now getting a good reputation, but it wasn't enough. Ivar wanted to grow even faster. So Ivar had realized the one thing that people love the absolute most is dividends. When you bought one of Ivar's stocks, you would be guaranteed a 20 to 22% dividends per year. That means if you just owned one of his stocks and just held it for 5 years, you would be 100% paid back. That is an insane amount, especially when you compare it to the fact that around the time it was normal to pay 5 to 7% dividends. And 5 to 7% would be considered quite high in today's standard. So Ivar built a bit of a legacy, built a bit of a reputation for the guy who always paid out 20 to 22%. Okay, but 22% in dividends was too good to be true, right? No, actually not. At this point of time, we have no reason to believe that he was a fraudster. That's crazy to think. Especially because at this point, he's already building an empire and man is barely 40 years old. At this point, this was a man who you can trust, but it wouldn't be like that forever. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, dun, dun. But this wasn't enough for Ivar, was it? He was building an entire empire in just 5 years. But in his words, Sweden was becoming too small for him. It was an old country, a country that was still had to do with a lot of royalty and just it was slow. And Ivar was fast, so he had to go somewhere way faster. So of course he went to the US of A. I think we all know that in the 1920s, the US of A had a certain boom in the stock market, one that Ivar particularly wanted to be a part of. So in 1922, when he journeyed to the US, he decided that he was going to start a company so that he would allow the Swedish Match Company to be sold stocks internationally on both European and US markets. To be precise, Ivar went over there with little to no plan except get US and international investors on his team. So what he did was that he started IMCO, International Match Company. The name makes a lot of sense when you think about it. And he couldn't just start this alone, could he? Oh, hell no. He started this with 3 Boston bankers. So that means that he immediately was a trustworthy person. There are already US-based bankers involved within 12 months of the operation starting. That's quite impressive when you think about it. Now, how the hell could a businessman from Sweden travel across the Atlantic and then just meet these bankers and sweet talk them? I find that very peculiar. Here's the thing though. Rumors and reputations spread across the Atlantic. And when you are a guy paying 22% dividends, your reputation follows you everywhere in the goddamn world. Bankers love that shit. They really freaking like it, okay? And for a while, business was well. From 1922 to 1925, everything was normal and the business was still legit. Don't worry, we'll get to it very shortly. So while the US was having their roaring 20s and just exploded on the stock market, Europe exploded for another reason, or well, had just recently exploded, because they were rebuilding after World War I. Okay, that's a bit dark. But here's the deal, right? When you are a country who's just been in a long, expensive war and you have to rebuild, that is something that's very expensive. And most likely you spend all your money on the goddamn war that just happened. So you can't afford to rebuild your own country. So what do? Well, you have to go out and borrow money. And that's the deal. When there's such a widespread war happening in a continent and it's typical for governments to loan money from each other and there's no freaking government with money, what the hell do you do then? You go to local banks? Bank? Well, most of them said no. And the ones that said yes gave horrible conditions. European countries would even try to go to the US as their countries and as their government and even their banks. And again, horrible conditions. Any sane person would have to say no to these conditions. And most countries were in fact sane. So what did they do? They had to rebuild, they still needed the money, and they couldn't go anywhere to get them. Well, almost anywhere. Because our main man Ivar, of course, were willing to give out loans to the governments. Of course, this is Ivar. I think you've already guessed it. There's a few catches. Ivar would come in and say, I will give you the loan. You'll get it by the end of the day. And there's no need for politics, committees, and all this messy stuff. Instead, you'll get the loan and I will get rights and monopoly to sell matches in your country. This is, of course, a huge catch. honestly, surprisingly many countries just said, hell yeah, let's do it. And here's why they said yes. Ivar was selling safety matches. See, at the time, there were two types of matches. There were the white sulfurous ones, the ones that you could just light on any surface whatsoever. The ones you've seen in cowboy movies being light on boots and being all cool. Well, those were hella dangerous. They would burn down cities and everything because they would just self-ignite all the time. So they were an insane fire hazard to a continent that was already rebuilding itself. That didn't really make a lot of sense. So they needed safety matches, and that was Ivar's deal. Ivar was the single largest producer in the world at the time of safety matches. So, of course, it was a win-win. Safety matches are the ones that you know where you have to strike the side on the box and suddenly it ignites. So at this point, Ivar is starting to loan out money to governments to help them rebuild, gaining monopolies all over Europe in selling his safety matches. And this is actually why he got the nickname the Match King. Because he wasn't just the Match King of Sweden, or hell no, he was the Match King of the goddamn world. In fact, at the time, around 60 to 70% of all matches in the entire world was sold by our dear Swede. That is a lot of goddamn matches, okay? This was in the modernized world, you can see the table right here, is the actual market share itself. And he just dominated absolutely everywhere. So everyone just kind of assumed, this is a great businessman. He's rich, he's doing well, he's incredibly profitable. So these 22% dividends? Not so weird. They seemed rather legit. However, in several countries, Ivar was forced to sell the matches at a loss. So he wasn't actually turning a profit, or at least nearly the same profit that everyone just assumed that he had. In fact, Ivar was losing money, like outright losing money to sell to some countries such as Poland. This is an important turning point in the history of Ivar. Up until this point, he had been a mostly legit businessman. Maybe he had cut some corners. If he did, we wouldn't know it. So what happened? How did he go from being one of the most successful businessmen in the entire world to involved with politics, loaning out money to rebuild the entirety of Europe, to suddenly turning into one of the largest fraudsters in the history of the world? Well, the stock market crashed. You see, Ivar had been doing a little something called inflating his own stock value. IMCO had a lot of ups and downs. You see, already before 1929's famous stock market crash, the stock market was volatile. That means you just have crazy ups and downs. And that was horrible for your reputation, horrible for borrowing money, and in general horrible for attracting new investors. So Ivar didn't want any of that business. Oh no, he wanted something stable. He wanted to be the stable guy of Wall Street, so that if you had to turn anywhere to invest your money, it would be with Ivar. He managed to do so. How? This is where things becomes a little bit interesting. So Ivar essentially would buy back in secret his own shares. So if there was a bad day, a bad month, a bad week on the stock market, he would go out with his own money or the money of the holding companies and just simply inflate the price. But here's the deal. He was using a lot of money. He was burning through all his own cash, just buying back his own stocks. So what did he have to do? Well, he had to make damn sure that next year you get even more investors. Now, if you're noticing something here, yes, this is starting to look like a Ponzi scheme. And essentially, when you need new investors to come in to pay out dividends to the old investors and essentially just living investor to investor, you are approaching a Ponzi scheme. And in fact, in the mid-1920s, Charles Ponzi on Wall Street was found out, and I'm guessing at the exact same time, our dear friend Ivar started doing somewhat the same, but just on top of a legitimate business. Now, Ivar could have gone on and done this for a very long time. Unlike Charles Ponzi, he wasn't discovered in the mid-1920s because Ivar had a solid business to stand on. If anyone asked, he could always just point back to Europe, to the many businesses that he used to run. So what the hell happened? Well, he couldn't continue to afford buying back his own stock. And when he couldn't afford buying back his own stock anymore, what would he do? Oh, he would go out to borrow money to buy back his own stock. He would literally go out in the real world, sit down with a banker, face to face say, I need money to do this new business venture. What is the business venture? Matches in Sweden. Matches in Sweden. What he actually was meaning is that, oh no, I want to buy back my stock because it's looking dark today, man. In the beginning, he was just giving out the loans, but as he continued this, and as he loaned more and more money, they wanted collateral. Wall Street needed to see something real. So he would pull up the bonds that he literally helped rebuild Europe, saying, oh yeah, Germany owes me 100 million. So you know I'm good for the money because Germany will totally pay me back, right? Germany will totally survive the 1930s. Yikes. So he would go out and do this. Except one thing. He's rumored to have used the same bonds at several different bankers to obtain loans to buy back his own stocks. That is already quite a red flag. But in addition to that, he ran out. He continued this scheme, but at the end of the day, there wasn't enough bankers and there wasn't enough loans that he could do any collateral with. So he couldn't obtain any more money. He was strapped out for cash. There's this story where Ivar had to pay out a small bill, an invoice of only 11 million. And remember, this is one of the richest men in the entire world at the time. Imagine Elon Musk coming in the news and not being able to pay a small bill of like $1 million. You'd be like, okay. Didn't he just buy Twitter for billions of dollars? Well, yeah, he did. And he also used collateral, but that's a whole other thing. Ivar was very reliant on getting new investors all the time, getting new loans all the time, and he was so strapped for cash, he couldn't even pay small bills anymore. What happened? Well, kind of the inevitable happened. The stock market crashed. And so did Ivar, really. You see, when the stock market crashed, his value, of course, went down to the rock bottom. And now he had a bunch of outstanding loans that he couldn't pay back because he couldn't get new investors in. And in general, his business was not doing as good as he was running around town saying. So in and around the last 1920s, he was essentially lying about the profits of his business to obtain new loans, to withhold the value of his stock, all based on lies, deceives, and essentially criminal, like a financial fraud. Now, that's a bit sad that his own ego pushed him so far, but let's not think too much about that. This, of course, leads to Ivar saying, okay, how do I save this? How do I come back from this? Well, Ivar made a very big gamble in the 1930. Just 12 months after the market crashed, he was like, this is the all-time low, and today I will buy so many stocks and I will be on the rise again. Guys, just one little issue. The stock market dipped 32 months after, not 12. And so began 20 of the worst months of his life. I guess except the very last one. It was a slow, painful death of a rather legit business until ego took over. By the 1930s, the fall of Ivar was inevitable. So eventually investigations started. The banks were circling in. They were like, what is happening? They demanded auditors to come into the company and look through the paper, look through the financial reports. What is actually happening inside this company? Because remember, this is the 1930s and 20s. Up until this point, it wasn't common to publicly announce your accounts the same way that it is today. We will get back to that because that is kind of funny. Now the banks were cracking all over. No surprise, this is the 1929's crash of the US. We all know how bad it actually got. But it was even worse for Ivar and even worse for Sweden. You see, Ivar couldn't answer a single question. If anyone asked him, any of the banks, any of the auditors, the US Senate, how do you have this kind of profit? He would always just point back to say, my business is booming back in Europe. He had embezzled 20 billion in today's money and in general, market manipulation to an extreme degree. Actually, side note, he had borrowed 10% of the GDP in Sweden. 10%! Imagine every 10th person in an entire country just giving their entire money to him and just saying, you're the horse I bet on, you freaking go out there and have an amazing race. And then it's just a fraudster. It's very, very devastating for a country. I was starting to feel the pressure. I mean, of course he was. He was literally pulled in to a US Senate hearing. Why he couldn't answer a single question very well. You see, lawyers wanted to know why the Boston bankers of Lee, Hicks and Company, someone who had been cold-bloodedly selling bonds to the Kreuger and Toll Company, aka they had been selling debt on behalf of Ivar into his company to essentially fund it, how they just been doing it, and they wanted numbers, and because the lawyers were forcing the Boston bankers for numbers, now they were also forcing Ivar for numbers. So it wasn't just, governments or banks. No, it was his close allies now also asking for questions. You see, Ivar had always been a very protective guy, a secretive guy. He had been very calculated. Whenever he made a public appearance, it has sort of been scripted. There's even this story of Ivar practicing how to tell a story of his travels in front of the mirror for hours before going out to a party at night and then retelling that story. And that was who Ivar was. Now he couldn't tell story anymore. He couldn't show things in black and white. What did he do? Now we're in 1932. Ivar has a hearing in Paris with a committee put down by the Swedish government and several other governments to ask, where's our money? What's happening? Just tell us what's happening. But Ivar couldn't. So there's this very famous story that just 1 week before this, Ivar goes into a banker on Wall Street with forged bonds to Italy. Again, the bonds were the loans given out to the government. Forged bonds to Italy in the 1930s is saying that you forged the signature of Mussolini or his financial minister. Mussolini, the dictator. Man wasn't fucking around. That is an insane move. The cojones it took to do that. Whew, I couldn't.
Biggest balls.
Biggest balls. Big ass cojones. And he went into this Wall Streeter, dead on said, Italy owes me 200 million. You can extend the loan 12 months and I'll just pay you back in 12 months. I don't have to pay you back today. But the banker was saying, no, you're not doing that. So Ivar was like, shit, I gotta pack. Back to Europe he went. In Europe, things just got so much worse. So Ivar returns to Europe, where a committee in Paris is waiting for him. A committee of Swedish officials, one put down by the government to ask what the hell is going on. And here comes an issue. Ivar turns up to this committee, tries to answer questions, but he couldn't, because he would be admitting to fraud. They were asking tough questions, such as, show us the money! Ivar proceeds, understandably, to have one of the worst hearings or meetings of his entire life. He left at a horrible meeting, went into a gun shop in Paris, bought a Browning revolver, went back to his apartment, and later that night was found with a gunshot wound through his heart. There was a note on the table reading regret and was addressed to one of his deputies. At least, this is the story that the police want you to know. The police. Do we trust them in Paris? This is also the story that ran in newspapers the morning after. The Match King has been found dead. Match King shoots himself in Paris. There were a few things that made this incredibly suspicious. I think it's no secret that Ivar had made a lot of enemies. He had made government officials dictators. Like forging Mussolini's signature was a bold move, dude. And in general made quite a lot of people a very strong enemy. So to call foul play on his unaliving himself doesn't seem too far out there. In fact, throughout the years, close friends of his would write books claiming foul play to the family who would end up running a lot of the Swedish match company. And in general, there was a lot of conspiracy theories out there just running around how he really could have died, if this really was true. And much like the next guy, I do love a good conspiracy theory. They're fun, they're entertaining, and that's also what I want to do with this video. But in reality, over the last few years, he had started doing a few things that make me think at least that he did it himself. First of all, due to all the stress, he had literally began to lose his own memory. This guy was meticulous. He was known for being one of the best memories in the entire world, doing crazy calculations in his head on the fly on an everyday basis, to going into forgetting appointments, forgetting where he was, and forgetting just all these small things that he normally would have remembered. His physical health became worse as the stress increased, naturally. And over the last few years, he was starting to make a will. Now, he was literally preparing for an inevitable death. Some sources even claim that he was embezzling money out, hiding money. So that kind of leads to the fact, would he just have escaped? Some conspiracy theories argue that why would he, once so rich, not just try to run to Argentina?
Argentina is a safe haven.
Argentina is a safe haven for
a lot of people with trouble coming.
Yeah, especially as the 1940s. There's also another strong rumor put forth by one of his friends. So 1 week later, after this hearing and after his death, he was supposed to go to Germany to fund one of the political parties that would run against Hitler. One of the ones that was most likely to win. Now, the timeline doesn't fully perfectly add up, but the fact that he had made enemies all over the world, it didn't seem too strange that some foul play could have been involved. But like, what a conspiracy theory, right? We have dictators, we have government officials, we have money throughout all of the world involved. We have a fraudster committing huge embezzlements and crimes. So honestly, I think this is like, if ever you have to commit into the idea of conspiracy, this is it. This is now. So go out there, leave a crazy conspiracy theory in the comments. I want to hear it. I want to have fun reading about it, okay? Now this leaves us with the after mess of his death. Yes, I said mess, because oh boy was that messy. Remember, in Sweden, they had borrowed 10% of the GDP to this man. 10%. I think it's quite understandable that the country went through a very tough financial crisis. A crisis fittingly known as the Kreuger crisis. Now, it wasn't just in Sweden. Man had international reach before Pitbull did, okay?
Mr. Worldwide.
Mr. Worldwide. No, the Kreuger crash also set in the US. Meaning that a country already going through a financial hard time after the freaking stock market crash, they just became even worse. Now, there was a lot of banks and a lot of people that he owed money to. A lot of people owed a small part of his companies. And the question was, who owned the rest of it? Because there's still a lot of assets. There was still a matchmaking company, there was a media company, a telephone company. So who actually owned the different things? Well, we don't know, and this is a good time to mention a really important detail. As of 2025, or today, it is very common, or well, legally required, that a company that is publicly traded makes a public accord of their financial records, makes an overview, a summary, a financial report, a fiscal report. I think we've all seen these or heard about these where, oh, this company made so much money last year. The only reason you know that is because they were legally forced to make that public. Also, this wasn't a thing in the freaking 20s or 30s. So the only person who had any idea of what actually was going on was Ivar. He was the only person knowing about all the different holding companies, all the different shell companies, all the different hidden companies that, well, only he had, and he had made for himself. Or well, essentially to embezzle money. Now, this meant that because of how chaotic, stressful, and difficult it was to trace back, a new set of laws was put in. So the reason that we today have a financial report that had been published and, importantly, externally validated by a third-party accounting company, one typically in most countries registered or given a license by the government, is because of Ivar Kreuger. When the US made the rule or made the law in the 1930s, they literally pointed to Kreuger and this case as an example of why they needed it. Imagine that your screw up, that the turnover and the aftermath of your death is so bad that the US government wants to get involved and create new laws. Okay, I do think that this particular law is kind of inevitable and would have happened either ways for one reason or another, maybe after Ponzi or I don't know. But let's be real, it is insane to think that this is directly caused because of Ivar. But this wasn't all, was it? Of course it wasn't. It's Ivar. There's always more to the damn story. Don't worry, I've linked 3 books, a TV show, a movie, and other things in the description below. So if you do want to go headfirst into this, just skip the Wikipedia page. This video is better anyways. Dive into that. The Wikipedia page has a lot of false information on it. That's another thing. I think there's absolutely no surprise that today, if a manager, a CEO, and a team of board members falsify the numbers, they will be held legally accountable. I mean, that kind of just makes sense, right? They are lying to the public. They're committing some kind of falsity, some kind of crime. This wasn't a law in the 1920s and 1930s. I'm sure they would have found some other way of prosecuting him if he was given the opportunity, but since he offed himself, that was never the case. So in the 1930s, the US also introduced a law saying that the managers had to sign and become legally accountable for the numbers they presented. Of course, there can be mistakes, but if you are intentionally creating falsehood, then you could go to jail, then you could be prosecuted criminally. This is an important point, because this rule is also common in Sweden, Denmark, all over the world today, not just the US. So these laws were introduced in the US and widespread immediately. They were adopted by any other company. So again, just imagine that your accounts, when you die, are so messy that literally half the world decides to introduce new laws to make sure that this will never happen again. The US Senate literally said, and US Congress literally said that we will not let the Kreuger crisis happen one more time, so we will now set up all these new rules to make sure it doesn't happen. Like, this screw up was insanely big, and I actually have to thank Ivar a little bit, which is kind of weird, but on the daily, I work as a senior developer, creating accounting software and creating software for the banking to make sure that all regulations are held. So my job probably wouldn't have been there if it weren't for Ivar and the rules that he kind of indirectly forced on the governments. Okay, but this kind of leaves a few questions. At least it did to me. Now we have the entire storyline, but there's a few things still tinkering there, isn't there? What did Ivar do with all his money? We couldn't point to it on a piece of paper. Did he just use all of his money on buying back his own stocks? Did he loan all the money out? What actually happened?
Hookers and strippers, you know.
He was a gentleman. He did not do hookers and strippers. But it would be funny. Powder and winter Latinas. That's what he did. For anyone not knowing, winter Latinas are just basically Russian women. I'm sure there'll be some guy on Reddit one day figuring all this out. And when that happens, dear God, send me an email, okay? I want to know. And it also kind of asks the questions, will we ever figure out what happened with all the money? No, I don't think so. We are talking about paperwork that happened 80 years ago. Hell, a piece of paper might not even be readable at that point. Like, all of this happened across continents in different countries before World War. And if they couldn't figure it out back then, where they had the best opportunity to, when they could literally just trace things down, where people were still alive, ain't no way they're figuring out that today. So he may have gotten away with something. He may have gotten away with hiding money for a family or for a girlfriend. We don't know.
He didn't even have kids.
No, he didn't have kids. He also didn't have a wife.
I swear his home must have been like empty. There's been like one painting on the wall.
Or I just imagine Scrooge McDuck home and just goes and dives into
I
coins.
don't think so. There's too much character.
And another question that just hangs up in the air. How the hell did this man fool so many people? What about him made to be the chosen one to do all of this? He's the Anakin Skywalker of this universe. I'm saying, okay? Well, as discussed, the rules were different back then. And this whole trust me bro was a very different thing. It was very common. It wasn't just him doing it. There was a lot of well-off businessmen who did this back then. So the way that Ivar got away with it was just being a gentleman, or being an outstanding person. On the screen right now, I'll show you a few quotes of how he communicated with his friends. This is dope. This is so old. Like, just imagine texting one of your friends like this. They might be like, yo, what is going on? That doesn't matter. He was quoted as a charming person, someone who could win over just about anyone, someone who was so well-spoken and such a good storyteller that when he started telling a story about his travels or just about anything, the entire room would quiet down and just listening. People mention forgetting what they were talking about, forgetting what they were thinking about, just honed in by Ivar's storytelling skills. Did those 22% dividends really mean that much to people, or were they just buying because of his character? Honestly, I'm pretty damn sure the money spoke for themselves. I think it was the 22% that kind of was the nail in the coffin that convinced people, and then his personality and who he was kind of just the thing that enticed people. You know, they got the first drink because of the personality, they stayed because of the money. Kind of makes sense. Okay, and this kind of did lead me down another bit of a rabbit hole. Did he in fact do a Ponzi scheme before Charles Ponzi? Coming up in the next video. No, I'm fucking joking. And the answer is potentially. And that's a weird answer to give. And because Charles Ponzi was found out in the mid-1920s, he was given the name, the title. Here's the thing though. We don't completely know on what day or exactly when Ivar started doing this. It is heavily speculated and assumed that this started after he came to the US, and also after a few years after having been to the US. So he most likely started before or just around the time when Charles Ponzi was discovered. So essentially he invented his own version of a Ponzi scheme before he could learn from Charles Ponzi. I kind of find that funny. The man was a very creative financier, but to invent your own fraud and your own scam mid one of the most legendary frauds in the entire world, kind of bold.
That's crazy.
That's kind of cool. So next time one of your friends or family asks you to borrow money, remember, money always have strings attached, even if it's fucking Elon Musk or Ivar Kreuger. And I'm sure that there are many other questions about Ivar Kreuger that I haven't been able to answer in this. So if you are genuinely more interested, please do check the link in the description and check out the books and report back whatever you find. I want to hear more conspiracy theories, goddammit. So if you liked the video, please subscribe. I love going down these rabbit holes. It's kind of intense for me and I end up not sleeping and eating for a little bit, but it's okay. I'll find a healthy way. Don't worry. And yeah, let me know what the next story should be on.